different ways of peeling back this orange. If I go to the, the specific reason that led me to reflect on issues of war, it had to do with a job opportunity. All right? I moved to Norway in 1997. I have a Norwegian wife. And I took a year's leave of absence from my job at Fordham University in New York City. And I watched our daughter for 6 months. She was about a year old, and so I was a home dad. And then I started looking around for, job opportunities, and contacted a friend who sits in the office next door, who's a fellow philosopher. His name is Henrik Sisa. And Henrik told me that a research group had just started up here at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, examining humanitarian intervention, right? Because in the late 90s, that was a very hot theme, because we had, war in Yugoslavia, there was the Rwanda genocide, and so there are lots of reflections about whether military force ought to be used to protect civilians from attack. And then Henrik said, well, we've got this research group looking at humanitarian intervention. You have a background in medieval philosophy, right? So I wrote my doctoral thesis on the medieval Catholic philosopher Thomas Aquinas. And Henrik said, well, the roots of the just war idea, the idea that military force can be used for moral ends, he said the roots of that idea is in the Middle Ages. So he said, perhaps you'd like to join our research group. And so that was good news for me, because I was looking for work. And it was at that point that I began explicitly reflecting on matters relating to war and peace. But knowing that you would ask me this question, I started thinking back, this morning. And I still remember when the Gulf War broke out, I was just starting out as a professor of philosophy. My first job was at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. And I remember the dean of the School of Philosophy, he said, well, left a message on my, telephone recording machine. I wasn't at home when he called. He said, would you be willing to speak about the just war criteria, right? The so-called reasons that can justify resorting to armed force. Would you be willing to speak with a reporter about that? Because there's some program that's going to air on the recent the war that's just now started, the attack on Iraq, to liberate Kuwait. And I was just petrified. I said, well, what can I say about that? I have no idea, So I managed to evade the bullet. But, if I think back even further, why war became a question for me, there are elements in my family background that would lead me to think about such matters. And I'll mention two. First of all, my father, who grew up in New Jersey, Newark, New Jersey, was a soldier in the Second World War. And he fought in one of the greatest battles of the war, called the Battle of the Bulge, or the Battle of the Ardennes. And, he told me growing up just a few stories about that battle. And it was enough to kind of raise questions for me. One of the stories he told me was, the battle took place around Christmas, 1944. And it was extremely cold. People were freezing to death. He found refuge in a farmhouse, and with a companion. And it had been, snowing heavily. And they got up in the morning, and his friend opened the shutters. I don't know whether it was Christmas morning or around. And he said, "Look, Dave," and he was shot between the eyes. So my dad crept up to the window, and he saw that his companion, fellow soldier, had just been shot by a kid, looked like, in German uniform, looked like he was maybe 14, 13, 14, really young. And my dad shot the kid. And the fact that he told me the story, because he said very little about the war, shows me there was something that disturbed him about that incident. You know, it's just rolling around in the back of his mind. And, you know, it brings up the whole question of child soldiers that we're dealing with today. And curiously, when I was in New York just in September, and I went out to dinner with one of my brothers and his two children, and we started talking about my father and, you know, his wartime experience came up. And my brother said, "Did Dad ever tell you the story about what happened to the German prisoners?" I said, "No, he never said anything about German prisoners." So what happened there is my dad spoke some German. So he was in the occupation force and put in you know, they had a group of German prisoners with them. And on my dad's account, the German officers were very arrogant and they didn't follow instructions. And so the commanding officer of that unit said, "If they get out of line one more time, shoot them." And they got out of line. I don't know what they did. And my dad, along with the others, shot them. So this is actually a bad thing to do, killing prisoners of war. And it really took me aback, now that I've done all the research on this theme, that my father had taken part in that. And apparently it was not so uncommon. Now a lot of reports are coming out. I mean, the Germans did it all the time, killing prisoners. But there are more and more reports about the, you know, American soldiers doing the same. So again, I think he was troubled by this. This is one of those things that he had to live with. So this raises philosophical questions. You know, now there are very big discussions among ethicists working on war about who is a legitimate target of war. Is it just by convention that we don't kill prisoners of war? Or is there some deeper moral reason for that? So I've given you a rather long answer. I'll just mention one other thing. I have an uncle, great uncle that I have my middle name from, Martin. He signed up as a fighter in the Spanish Civil War. This was around 1936. And he fought with something called the International Brigade, which was a group of soldiers fighting in support of the Republican government. Anyway, my uncle was captured along with his fellow fighters. And the Americans in the group were, somehow they found refuge, I think, in a Portuguese embassy. The specifics are unclear. But he couldn't demonstrate he was an American citizen, whereas the others could, and they were released. He was executed by firing squad. So this has led me now to become interested in the Spanish Civil War. And there are many interesting parallels of that war with what's going on today. And you know, there are a lot of discussions and attention paid to the Islamic State, you know, or, you know, ISIS, as people who are engaged in fighting for religious rationales. But if you look at the Spanish Civil War, the opponents of the Republican government, under the leadership of Franco, believed, many of them, that they were waging a holy war. And in fact, you find theologians, Catholic theologians of the period, writing books. I've got one, I just lent it to a colleague so I can't show you, entitled Holy War. And the term was used not as a term of criticism, but actually in a praiseworthy sense. That we're doing something important here for God and for, you know, the religious life of our nation. And terrible atrocities were carried out. So so a good part of my research agenda right now is to examine this idea of holy war and religious rationales for war. There's no, start off by saying that the term just war is a traditional term, right? You find it stretching all the way back to Aristotle, right? And maybe it's Cicero, the Roman philosopher, who made it, so famous, and then it was adopted within Christianity. The term holy war does not have the same kind of ancient lineage. So what people refer to as holy war in a Christian context, ordinarily, it refers to the Crusades. But you don't find theologians writing about the Crusades using the term holy war. So, some people use the term holy war as a term that to establish a sharp contrast with just war, right? So just war would be a war waged for rationales that do not require any sort of special religious revelation, right? Now, if you're speaking in a kind of a Catholic theological context, you'd say that just war is based on natural rationales, the sort of rationales that we can reach by virtue of our human nature and know through reason, right? Rationales based on justice, punishment, security, order in human society, and so forth. The term holy war is often used to refer to a war that's waged for rationales that can't be known through reason alone. So, for instance, during the Middle Ages, one of the reasons for mounting the Crusades was to regain the Holy Land, which was a land thought to have been consecrated by the blood of Jesus Christ. And they even argued that because Jesus had consecrated this land, right, through his life and especially his death, the land was the possession of Christians. It was the inheritance of Christians. And so that this land should be regained for Christians. It was rightfully their property. But it was a property right based on a theological premise. So this would be one instance of a holy war. Now, some authors take it a step further, and they say that because a holy war is based on divine reasons, and at the most extreme form is done at a kind of command of God, an ordinance of God, the ordinary rules of war don't apply there, right? And so for some authors, holy war is the most extreme kind of war. It's a war waged without the ordinary limits that one should observe according to the just war idea. And you do find some medieval writings that speak in this way. Rivers of blood. People talk about killing in God's name and so forth. But then there's a competing literature about what we now call holy war. And the competing literature says that an act that we carry out through grace, an act that we carry out, in somehow linked with faith, must have its proper natural integrity. So, for instance, through faith, we are asked to, we are urged, we are encouraged, maybe you can say commanded to donate money to the poor. But it would be wrong to donate to the poor money that you've stolen. Right? So some people argue, and this also you can find in the medieval text, that any war that's carried out, so-called, for a divine end, must be even more restricted in the means used than even a just war. See, so the argument will cut in exactly the opposite way. This can seem like very medieval stuff, but if you look at the Spanish Civil War, you find a lot of this being played out And it's not so long ago, you know. It's just a little over, you know, it's just a little bit over 100 years ago. So these are sort of not dead issues. And of course, the issue's still alive within the Islamic context, you know, for instance, Islamic State and, you know, related developments. The reality is that religion is our attempt to understand the world, our place in it, and God, right? So religion is our fundamental attempt to discern meaning. So really just about anything of importance to us will come into under the heading of religion, will be assessed through a religious lens. So for instance, you know, economic relations, there's a whole lot one can say from a religious perspective. So it's not at all surprising that, you know, religion could, that one would have many things to say about violence from a religious perspective. Now, most religious traditions don't start from the supposition that any possible engagement in violence is wrong. I mean, if you go to the ancient texts of the Jewish tradition, you find lots of positive comments about engagement in violence. So, for instance, the punishment of certain crimes. And there's also the idea that you find in many religions that God protects his people. You know? And so God protects his people by helping them help themselves. Right? And so you get lots of, you know, religious texts about fighting off enemies, and that we're sustained in fighting off our enemies by faith, and so forth. The reason why you could come with the question you did is that if you look at it from a specifically Christian optic, and if you go to the words of Jesus in the New Testament, words like turn the other cheek, and so forth, there seems to be you know, sort of religion itself seems to proceed from a sort of an opposition to any kind of participation in violence. And so then you say, well, how could religion allow for such a thing? But of course, this was a big topic for medieval theologians to understand whether Jesus' words really did prohibit any kind of participation in violence. And of course, violence is a broad term. It can cover lots of things. It can, self-defense involves violence, you know. So, so what we'd have to do if we want to talk about links between religion and violence is we've got to kind of get more fine-grained about what do we mean by violence, what kinds of violence are we referring to, and so forth. You've got in several religious tradition parallels to the just war idea, you know, very clearly. I mean, in the Hindu tradition, for instance, there are quite extensive writings that talk, you know, using somewhat different terms, but which can be translated as, you know, just and unjust war. You know, Bhagavad Gita has plenty to say about this. And actually, martial imagery is quite important within the Hindu tradition. And you know, there are leading Hindu authors who speak about war sometimes in approving ways, and in other cases, you know, speaking about it in you know, terms of restraint. But you know, in Buddhism, one finds parallel developments, and you know, maybe less extensive than what you'd find in Christianity or Judaism, but it's certainly present. I've got a book, by the way, on my shelf here called Zen at War. And the book was about ways in which Zen monks, heads of monasteries, supported by their discourses and their sort of religious reasonings, the buildup of Japanese militarism, you know, in the run-up to the Second World War. And, you know, this comes back to your question, politics needs religion more than religion needs politics. Well, I think I mean, this would be a case in point. Because religion, because it provides deep meaning on our lives, can be a very useful tool for politicians to justify their initiatives. I mean, it's a way to get people motivated. This is a little bit of an aside, but you know, you and I had a brief chat before the interview started about the Donald Trump surprise win, and the man he's named chief strategist at the White House, Steve Bannon, gave an interview at the Vatican in 2014, and it's quite striking how he plays off some holy war tropes, holy war kind of references. He doesn't use the term, but quite a bit about, you know, we're at the beginning of a worldwide war. We have to prepare ourselves. We have to realize hundreds of years from now we're going to be judged at how we handled ourselves, you know. He speaks about Judeo-Christian, our Judeo-Christian civilization, how it's under threat, and it's up to us to preserve it. This was all very much the way that the sort of crusading theology was framed for many years. So you know, so I think it's very, and again, this is very useful to support a political agenda, right? The agenda would be a certain kind of reaction to developments in the Middle East. And you place those developments in a kind of quasi-eschatological, almost a cosmic perspective. That's very motivating to people, right? You want to get hearts and minds on board. It's not always a bad thing. You know what I mean? It can be very bad. I'm very skeptical about the line taken by Bannon. But, you know, there were Christian thinkers who thought that our faith, in a way, could be a factor motivating opposition to National Socialism. All right, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So this can all, you know, all of this can cut two ways. It's never straightforwardly wrong. Anyway, this is a very hard question to answer because the word religion, by the way, is another one of these. It's a label that can have a multitude of different meanings. Okay? So, and if you read the specialists, that there's no agreed upon definition of what religion is. So how you count the conflict, the degree to which we have got more religiously motivated wars today, or, in comparison to the past, a lot depends on how you define key terms. To take your two examples, standardly, the First World War is not a war that's described as a religious conflict. I mean, it was mainly between, within Christendom, if you want to put it that way. There's, France on the one side, Germany on the other, and many Catholics on both sides, fighting against each other. So how could it be about religion? But if you examine that war, the religious dimensions were quite deep. Very, on the French side, which I've studied more than the German side, this was a war against a kind of pagan barbarism. And there's a famous discourse by a Belgian cardinal who talks about the martyrdom of the Belgian nation. He starts using very strong religious terminology, and he meant it, that somehow the very religious identity, the very existence of the nation, but the nation is bound up with its religious identity, was at stake. And so, and I've got a book on the First World War on my shelf here, and there's a chapter in it called, it's a book written in French, La Croisade, the Crusade, how that this was, much of the fight was viewed through a crusading lens, harking back to that age-old imagery. You know, the Second World War appears not to have been, in its essence, a religious conflict. But if you scratch below the surface, the National Socialist idea was very much about the eradication of, obviously, Judaism, but also Christianity. Christianity was thought to be subversive to the National Socialist idea. So in a way, you could view the National Socialist war as a kind of war on Christianity. So, and part of when we talk about religious conflicts, a conflict can be religious on one side in its motivation, maybe not on the other. Spanish Civil War was like that. The Republicans didn't view it as a religious conflict, although within some parts of the Republican, Republican cause, there were communists, there were anarchists also. They also vented their hatred of religion, So but on the Franco side, it was very much viewed as a religious struggle, right? A struggle to restore the Catholic identity of the nation. So in the Second World War, let's say you're a Christian. And let's say you join the resistance. Could you have a religious reasons for joining the resistance? I mean, yes and no. One, you could say, part of our religion teaches us to uphold justice. That read the Hebrew prophets, which are part of the corpus of holy texts for a Christian. Well, the centrality of justice is there. So, fighting against the Nazi domination, the persecution of whole nations and minority groups, you could see that as somehow engaging the faith insofar as the faith calls on us to work for justice. I've been studying one Catholic philosopher named Jacques Maritain, how some of his writings during this period. And it's interesting, he spoke very much in the way that I've just now presented, the centrality of justice. And then he says, should we call this a holy war? Because in some way our faith is engaged. And he says he thought that would be a sort of a dangerous step to take. He says this is a war for the good of civilization, but we should not speak of it as a war for for Christianity as such. Okay? And I think he was right in that regard. But this again points to the complexity of what religion is, and then we've got this other word, holy, and how that interfaces with the term religion. Clearly, if you look at the development of international law, which is the primary lens through which, issues relating to war and peace are discussed in public forums today, such as the UN, it all seems to be a very secular language. However, one of the virtues of Thomas Aquinas is that he is an author who's fluent, so to speak, both in the language of human reason and the language of divine revelation. And writing as a theologian, Aquinas will often give very good rational reasons based on our human nature for doing things. So first of all, an author such as Aquinas would not necessarily be opposed to what we today call a secular discourse, but which, well understood, is a discourse that appeals to what can be known through reason, does not make direct reference to divine revelation, but doesn't necessarily exclude it either. So I think one of the key pillars of the international law regime, as we understand it today, is that war, in the sense of use of armed force, when armed forces is resorted to, it should always be an exception, never the rule. It should not be the way that we handle our interrelationships. It shouldn't be the default when there's a dispute. Resorting to armed force should not be the default position. But if you trace back the history of that idea, it's very much an idea that you find in the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, that God created us to live in harmony. And so peace is the baseline condition of humanity. Peace is how we are meant to live with one another. So sometimes people disrupt the peace, all right, and they need to be countered. But it's this fundamental fact of human harmony, is how we're meant to live together. It's how God created us. That's a fundamental premise. And so, and much of the current international law outlook is built up around this sort of, what you could say, the primacy of peace, and circumscribing use of armed force into what you might call the exceptional. That which you don't do as a matter of course, as your default, but only under certain specified circumstances. Well, it's actually quite apropos that you bring up this point now, because basically the nuclear deterrence is built around the idea that fear is what provides us with the most effective security. Right? Basically, deterrence is a system whereby I let the would-be adversary know that should he strike me, I will retaliate. And so his fear of retaliation will exercise a moderating influence on his behavior. I'm referring to states here, by the way, so could have just as well said she. I'm very skeptical of this idea that the ultimate source of our security, living peacefully together, is that ultimate source is fear. And I think the whole notion of deterrence as being sort of the glue of international security, it has its origin in the thought, I could say, of Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes proceeds from the idea that human beings naturally have each other. We have each other. We're at each other's throats, and we need an arrangement to keep us off each other's throats. But that's not the outlook that you find in the Christian tradition, with the exception of some thinkers who really emphasize the original sin. All right, so you could end up with, yes, before the fall we were in a condition of harmony, but as a result of original sin, human beings have a inclination to wrongdoing, and hence, in order to prevent this wrongdoing from happening, we need fear has to be at the primary mechanism. But if you look at an author such as Thomas Aquinas, he thinks that the radical inclination to goodness has been in us has not been taken away by original sin, right? But original sin has weakened that impulse, made it more challenging. But that for human beings to live in peace, they need positive motivations. Fear is not a positive motivation, actually. And there's and so peace needs to be built up on other foundations. There's this great line, by the way, from Hugo Grotius, the Dutch thinker who lived, in the 17th century. Grotius said that there is no greater spur to wrongdoing than the fear of being wronged oneself. So fear can have an extremely destructive influence in the way human beings interact with each other. And the deeper the fear, the more the desire to prevent it and to take action before the threat materializes. So someone like a Steve Bannon, who's trying to dig that fear hole really deep, it's to justify certain forms of preventive action. And so, again, I would say most people don't do bad things out of hatred. There are some that do, or out of cruelty. Most people do bad things out of fear. So we have to be on our guard against systematic appeals to fear. I think, now in the case of nuclear weapons, there's a big discussion about, well, nuclear weapon hasn't been used for over 70 years now, so it's a so-called nuclear taboo. Right? Some argue that shows that deterrence works. Right? That, okay, this is why we haven't. And others argue, well, there are other reasons why we haven't used a nuclear weapon. And some maintain that the reason for the relative lack of world war, during this 70-year period, is not due to the system of deterrence at all. It's due to the increasing network of cultural and economic ties. Right? So there's more of a, so it's sometimes called the liberal peace picture that explains the relative lack of war over these last 70 years. Myself, I think that nuclear deterrence is inherently unstable as a system. It's true, no serious miscalculations have occurred. There have been accidents. There haven't been any accidents that have led to a nuclear weapons use, but some accidents have come pretty close. I think it's a very unstable situation to depend on, and it requires that our political and military leaders are perfectly rational agents, that they're going to make just the right calculation under circumstances of acute stress. I think that's very, I think we have good reasons to doubt that. Now, I worked with a Vatican sort of committee to draft a document relating to nuclear deterrence that's been endorsed by the Holy See. And we reached the conclusion in the document that the system of deterrence cannot be justified on moral grounds. But that's not equivalent to saying we should unilaterally disarm. That if you reach the moral conclusion, you've got it right now, give up your nuclear weapons. That in itself could be very destabilizing. And so I think that one has to work very hard towards the dismantling of the whole nuclear weapons regime and infrastructure. And although President Obama made this cornerstone of his presidency, unfortunately, I don't think he achieved very much. I'm disappointed in the lack of progress. And now under the Trump coming Trump presidency, I don't see a whole lot of hope for you know, a push towards nuclear disarmament. But I think it's a desirable goal. Not everyone agrees on that. Some thinks the best we have is to keep up the system of deterrence because nuclear weapons can't be uninvented. But I disagree with that. I think it is a very desirable goal. We need to work vigorously towards it. And currently in the world, we're facing just renewed expenditures on nuclear weapons, upgrades, and some countries like Pakistan are investing heavily in nuclear weapons, especially of the tactical sort. So we may be coming to a situation in which nuclear weapons are normalized. Not the big massive ones to take out a whole city that are the ones that have been, you know, developed for reasons of deterrence, but the smaller ones, right? The ones that, you know, that you could use one to burrow deep into a mountain and take out a Fordo, there are examples. But I think that's an extremely worrisome development, and we need to work at countering it because we're running the danger of a new arms race within this sphere of tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, already, we've had, a number of trends that have sort of, I would say, radically altered the landscape, but have resulted in significant changes. So, for instance, the use of drones in unmanned aircraft that can do pinpoint targeting on the ground. Among the various other uses of drones, they've been put to a kind of military use in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so forth to target individuals who are considered to be security risks. But this development has blurred the rather clear line that used to stand between war action, military action, and police action. Used to be in war, you were fighting an enemy force. You weren't going after this specific individual. There were some, exceptions. Like they would have tried to take out Hitler, if they could have. But generally, war was not fought in that way. So now, whereas it was law enforcement that would try to apprehend and under circumstances kill, individuals engaged in criminal behavior. So we've seen a real blurring of those two lines, and that's become very problematic. And now we've got cyber war on the horizon, and one of the, again, on the sort of classical conception of war, that war was fought between military units. And civilians, non-combatants, should be kept out of harm's way in the degree possible. Now we know that perspective often, failed, was not lived up to. But cyber war goes to the heart of, often to the heart of civilian infrastructure. A cyber attack can threaten the very essential infrastructure that a society depends on, because just about everything now is controlled by IT. The way reservoirs work, dams, you can, all sorts of facilities have an IT component. So all of this now can be penetrated through, cyber capabilities. So all of a sudden we're in a position where the foundations of civil life can be directly threatened. And it used to be you'd have to actually you'd have to first defeat the army of the would-be adversary in order to do harm to the civilian population, if that's what you wanted to do. But with the end of with the beginning of high altitude bombing, all of a sudden you didn't have to defeat the adversary army in order to get at the civilians. You could go right to them, and that's what happened in the Second World War. So now we have an extension of that. Well, drones is a way of doing that, but also now it's cyber war. So these are worrisome developments. Automated weapons, raises a whole new set of problems, somewhat distinct from the ones I've just mentioned. The challenge that you face with all of these things is none of them are absolutely clear, wrong in a clear-cut way. So, for instance, a cyber attack could be a very effective way, and maybe a justifiable way, in in conditional conflict of rendering an enemy missile silo inoperative. That's actually preferable to it, actually physically attacking it. So all these things can cut two ways, but anytime you get a new military technology, you've got the specter of an arms race that, on the horizon. And that we've got that with drones, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Apparently, Islamic State was, I believe it was Islamic State that had used a drone to carry out, a small drone was found and then was carried back to base, and it exploded. It was an armed drone, before that, the soldiers could get it back to base. So obviously they're developing that, and they'll start to, in the measure that they can, use it. So, so with any new military technology, we have to be aware of the, the potential for arms race, and that potential for arms race can outweigh the benefits you can get from the use of such a technology, which in some limited setting could be positive. Automated, not just automated, but automatons, forms of software that can be implanted into a weapon system that make decisions apart from a human agent. They've been, programmed to react in certain ways. The argument there supporting this new technology is that human beings often make bad decisions when under stress. Right? And, then that happens. Some, you can study some wartime atrocities. Often they happen under conditions of acute stress. And people who've taken part in some of them say it was like I was in a trance. I didn't even realize fully what I was doing until I came out of it. And that's what I did. It's like being in a condition of panic, but just working the opposite way. So, okay, having a weapon that's programmed that would bypass that sort of emotional reaction, that can be a plus. On the other hand, our emotions don't just lead us astray. Actually, our emotions can provide us with good instruction about the world around us. And if it wasn't for emotions that lead to compassion, for instance, there are things that we might do that would otherwise be wrong. So I don't know that I buy this argument that an emotionless decision is necessarily going to be the better decision. Some emotionally laden decisions are better, right? Much better. So by taking out that, quote, human element, you may be taking out something that makes for good battlefield judgment. And a lot depends on how the emotions are trained. So there's a big debate underway among the military ethicists about the relative, the pros and cons of autonomous weapon systems. I think that religion and religious leaders have a fundamental role to play. In a way, one of the strengths of the whole international law regime that we talked about earlier is that it proceeds from reason, does not make appeal to religion, divine reasons, and so forth. But that strength is also a weakness, because if you look at the world around you, I don't know, I'm not a number cruncher. There are millions and millions of people, even in the West, who act from religious motivations, who think that religion is a fundamental aspect of their lives. So, and it factors very much into their the motivation that people have in their daily lives, and not just in ordinary course of their lives, but also moments of great stress. The sorts of moments that come up when people feel that they're under attack or are under attack. So that there are individuals who can tap into the religious side of ourselves and speak to it, and speak that language and give good reasons for conduct that is in a measure to preserve peace. That's a very important thing. I had a conversation with a Iraqi cleric who was affiliated with the Sadr faction, and they fought the U.S. forces very hard combat in Fallujah, for example. And he made the point, I still remember when he was introduced, we went around the table, he said, I'm a cleric. He said, I'm a poet with the Sadr regime. So the Sadr faction. So I said, not often you get a poet into these discussions. He says, well, I thought it would soften the image. That was a good line. But he said, I can go into, he was what we would call a chaplain for students at the University of Baghdad. He said, I speak to hundreds of students, Friday prayer. He said, they'll do whatever I say. He said, that's an enormous responsibility. And he said this is a responsibility that we clerics have to take seriously and use for good ends. And I fully agree with him. I think, for instance, if you want to point to a leader, I think has done been a very positive influence. It's Grand Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq. And notice he's been a voice on behalf of peace, on behalf of an inclusive Iraqi society, but he hasn't been the voice of pacifism either. He made a famous call to arms for the Iraqi people to oppose Islamic State. But he was very careful to frame that call to arms in a non-sectarian way. And he said, he didn't say this is for the, for the advancement of the Shia Islam. He said, this is for the good of the Iraqi nation. And he cautioned against sectarian excesses, or starting to bring sectarian motivations into that struggle. I thought that was a very positive way to approach the matter. So, and obviously on the other side of the coin, everything in human life is mixed, including religion. What can be good also can turn bad. There's nothing you can point to in this world that's not like that. God is not like that, but God is not in the world. God is transcendent. So. Everything can cut two ways. So we have to be aware that religious leaders can also have a very pernicious influence. But I think on the whole, and so some people say, if only we could get rid of religion, we'd have no more conflict in the world. I think obviously that's an entirely unrealistic idea, but I think it's even an undesirable idea, because I think the best parts of ourselves originate from our link with what's transcendent, and those people who represent that transcendent, who, by virtue of their call, their training, and so forth, that they can motivate us in ways that are that are needed, that are very positive, that will be at the support of peace.